You fit the description and I'm not arguing about it.
Sir, I've done nothing wrong. You can verify my identity through dispatch.
Don't start talking like you're above this. I know what I'm looking at.
You're looking at a federal judge.
I don't care who you claim to be. Turn around.
At exactly 9:47 p.m., the unmistakable click of steel echoed through a gas station parking lot. And in that single sound, a decorated federal judge learned how quickly authority evaporates when prejudice walks in wearing a badge. The handcuffs clicked shut around her wrists at 9:47 p.m. Judge Claudia Brennan, a federal district court judge with 17 years on the bench, stood in the fluorescent glow of a gas station parking lot, arms pulled behind her back, while Officer Dennis Kovac told her to stop. Resisting. She wasn't resisting. She was asking questions. And apparently that was enough. This wasn't a case of mistaken identity. This wasn't a misunderstanding that would get cleared up in 5 minutes. This was a veteran police officer looking at a black woman in business, a tire pumping gas, and deciding she must be a criminal. What happened next would trigger a Department of Justice investigation, destroy multiple careers, and send a clear message about what happens when you handcuff a federal judge for absolutely no reason. The gas station sat on the corner of Westfield Avenue and Route 22, one of those brightly lit spots that stays open all night, selling coffee and lottery tickets to whoever needs them. Judge Brennan had stopped there after working late at the courthouse, reviewing case files for a complex fraud trial set to begin the following week. She wore a navy blue suit, her judicial robes long since hanging in her chambers. Her car, a silver sedan, was parked at pump number 4. Officer Kovac pulled into the gas station at 9:43 p.m. for minutes before everything unraveled. He was responding to a call about a stolen vehicle in the area. The description was minimal: a dark-colored sedan, possibly silver or gray, occupied by a black female. No plate number, no make or model, no distinguishing features. Just those sparse details broadcast over the radio 20 minutes earlier. Kovac scanned the lot and spotted Judge Brennan's vehicle. Silver sedan, black woman. In his mind, that was probable cause. He didn't run the plates. He didn't call for backup. He didn't observe any suspicious behavior. He simply decided this had to be a suspect and approached with his hand already resting on his service weapon. Judge Brennan noticed a patrol car, but thought nothing of it. Police stopped at the station regularly. She finished pumping gas, replaced the nozzle, and reached for her receipt when Kovac's voice sliced through the night air. He ordered her to step away from the vehicle and place her hands where he could see them. She turned confused. The officer stood 15 feet away, positioned behind his open car door, hands still gripping his weapon. Judge Brennan asked what the problem was. A simple question, reasonable under the circumstances. Kovac responded by repeating his command, louder this time, telling her this was her last warning before he considered her non-compliant. Here's what Judge Brennan did next. And pay attention, because this part matters. She calmly stated her name and title. She explained she was a federal judge heading home from work. She offered to show identification. She suggested the officer verify her identity through dispatch. She kept her hands visible. Her voice stayed steady. Everything she did was textbook de-escalation. Kovac heard none of it. Or rather, he heard it and decided it was a lie. In his mind, criminals claim to be anything when confronted. Doctor, lawyer, judge, whatever might get them out of trouble. The more firmly she asserted her identity, the more convinced he became that she was fabricating it. He told her to turn around and place her hands behind her back. Judge Brennan asked to speak with a supervisor. Kovac told her she could do that at the station. She asked what crime she was suspected of committing. Kovac said she matched the description of a suspect. She asked what description. He told her to stop talking and comply. The gas station security cameras captured everything. The footage would later become Exhibit A in multiple investigations. It showed Judge Brennan standing completely still, hands raised to shoulder height as Kovac approached from behind. It showed him yanking her arms down roughly. It showed the handcuffs locking into place. It showed her being escorted to the patrol car while other customers watched in stunned silence. A man filling his truck at the next pump called out, asking if everything was okay. Kovac told him to mind his business. A teenager working the register inside stepped to the door, phone already out and recording. Kovac didn't stop him, but his jaw tightened when he noticed. Judge Brennan was placed in the back of the patrol car at 9:51 p.m. for minutes from first contact to arrest, for minutes to derail a career and ignite a federal civil rights investigation. The back seat smelled like industrial cleaner trying to mask something worse. The plastic bench was cracked and uncomfortable. Judge Brennan sat perfectly upright, staring straight ahead, her mind already calculating what would happen next. She had sentenced people from her bench for civil rights violations. She had written opinions on unlawful detention and qualified immunity. She had lectured at law schools about Fourth Amendment protections. And now she was experiencing the other side of the system, handcuffed in a police cruiser because an officer saw her skin color before he saw anything else. Kovac climbed into the driver's seat and picked up his radio. He reported that he had detained a suspect matching the description from the stolen vehicle call. Dispatch asked if he had confirmed the vehicle was stolen. Kovac said he was transporting the suspect to the station for processing. Dispatch asked again about vehicle confirmation. Kovac didn't answer. The drive to the station took 8 minutes. Judge Brennan remained silent. Kovac did too. The radio crackled with routine traffic. Another unit responding to a noise complaint. Someone requesting a tow truck. The mundane rhythm of a Tuesday night, while a federal judge sat handcuffed in the back seat. Her credentials sat in her purse. Her judicial ID and her wallet. All of it ignored. They arrived at the station at 10:03 p.m. Kovac escorted Judge Brennan inside through the side entrance used for processing arrests. The booking area buzzed with the usual evening chaos. 2 officers finishing paperwork. A woman arguing on her phone. A man sleeping on a bench, apparently waiting for someone. No one looked twice at Kovac, bringing in another arrest. The officer working the booking desk was Sergeant Phyllis Dunham. She had 22 years on the force and had processed thousands of arrests. She was the first person that night who actually listened. When Kovac explained he had arrested a woman matching the description of a stolen vehicle suspect, Dunham asked to see the vehicle report. Kovac handed it over. Dunham read it slowly. Then she looked at Judge Brennan, still standing in handcuffs, wearing a business suit that likely cost more than Dunham earned in a week. Something didn't add up. Dunham asked Kovac whether he had confirmed the vehicle was actually stolen. He said he was bringing the suspect in for questioning first. Dunham asked if he had run the plates. The silence that followed answered her question. She turned to Judge Brennan and asked for her name. Judge Brennan provided it along with her title. Dunham's eyes widened slightly. She asked whether Judge Brennan had identification. The answer was yes. In her purse, still in her vehicle at the gas station. Dunham looked at Kovac with an expression that made her opinion of his police work unmistakable. She excused herself and walked straight to the watch commander's office. Lieutenant Victor Salazar was finishing reports when Dunham knocked. The conversation that followed lasted less than 2 minutes, but Salazar's face cycled through distinct stages. Confusion, disbelief, anger. The kind of anger that comes from realizing your department is about to be torn apart in the press and in court. Salazar came down to booking personally. He looked at Judge Brennan, still in handcuffs. He looked at Kovac, still convinced he had done solid police work. Salazar asked one question. Did you confirm anything before making this arrest? Kovac began explaining his reasoning, but Salazar cut him off. The handcuffs came off Judge Brennan's wrist at 10:18 p.m., 31 minutes after they went on. Salazar apologized repeatedly, while Dunham documented everything. Judge Brennan remained composed, but her first request silenced the entire booking area. She wanted every piece of documentation related to her detention, every report, every radio communication, every camera angle from the gas station and the police station. She wanted names, badge numbers, and the full chain of command notifications. Salazar knew exactly what that meant. This wasn't going away quietly. Judge Brennan made one phone call from the station, not to a lawyer, though she was one herself, not to family. She called the chief judge of the federal district court, Margaret Holloway, who had appointed her to the bench 6 years earlier. The call lasted 90 seconds. Holloway's only response was a quiet, "I see," followed by, "Document everything. I'll handle the rest." By midnight, 3 things happened simultaneously. The the Department of Justice received formal notification of a federal judge's unlawful detention. The state attorney general's office received a courtesy heads-up that something significant was unfolding, and the police chief, Raymond Foster, was awakened at home by a phone call that made him seriously consider early retirement. Foster arrived at the station at 12:40 a.m. wearing sweatpants and a department jacket. His first stop was Lieutenant Salazar's office, where he reviewed the gas station security footage, then the dash cam from Kovac's cruiser, then the body cam Kovac had apparently forgotten he was wearing. With each video, Foster's expression darkened. The facts were undeniable. Kovac had no reasonable suspicion. The vehicle wasn't stolen. The plates came back clean. Judge Brennan identified herself immediately. She offered credentials. She requested a supervisor. She complied with every command despite having zero legal obligation to do so. And Kovac arrested her anyway, because in his mind, a black woman in an expensive car at night had to be a criminal. Foster summoned Kovac into the office. The officer still believed he might be praised for being proactive. Instead, Foster suspended him on the spot. Badge and weapon surrendered immediately. Kovac started to argue, attempting to justify his reasoning, but Foster wasn't interested. He had seen officers ruin their careers through stupidity before. This was exceptional, even by those standards. Judge Brennan left the station at 1:15 a.m. She drove herself home in the same vehicle Kovac had labeled suspicious. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. She didn't speak to the press waiting outside, didn't issue a statement. She simply walked to her car with the same composed dignity she had maintained throughout the ordeal. But composed didn't mean she was letting it go. Not even close. The deposition transcript read like a prosecutor's dream. Cross had essentially admitted the department prioritized protecting officers over accountability. He'd seen problems and deliberately chose to bury them. When asked why, his answer was worse than silence. He said that's just how things worked. That everyone understood you didn't throw fellow officers on the bus over minor issues. Minor issues, that's what he called racially biased stops. The mayor received that transcript on a Thursday afternoon. By Friday morning, he was ready to settle. But Judge Brennan had a different plan. She didn't want money. She wanted change. Her settlement demands included a complete overhaul of the department's early warning system, mandatory bias training every 6 months, strict body camera footage review protocols, an independent oversight committee with subpoena power, and policy reforms requiring supervisors to document and investigate any pattern of complaints against officers. The city balked. Those demands would cost millions to implement and fundamentally alter how the department operated. Judge Brennan's response was simple. Take it, or see you in court, where a jury will award me twice what this costs and mandate the same changes anyway. She was right, and everyone knew it. A jury would watch the videos, hear about Kovac's history, learn about the complaints that were ignored, and return a verdict that would devastate the city's budget and reputation. Far worse than accepting her terms. 3 weeks of negotiations followed. The city tried to water down every demand. Judge Brennan refused to budge on the substantive reforms, though she agreed to extend implementation timelines to make them financially manageable. She also accepted a monetary settlement that was surprisingly modest, just enough to cover her legal fees and compensate for the violation she endured. This wasn't about getting rich. It was about making sure this couldn't happen to someone without her resources or knowledge. The settlement was announced on a Tuesday morning. The press conference was packed with reporters, civil rights advocates, and community members who had followed the case closely. Judge Brennan stood at the podium, composed and precise as always, and explained what had been achieved. She spoke about systemic reform, accountability, and the responsibility of those in power to wield it wisely. She never mentioned Kovac by name. She didn't have to. Everyone understood this case was bigger than one officer. Kovac himself had been fired 4 months earlier, shortly after Cross's deposition made headlines. The department announced his termination with a brief statement about conduct unbecoming an officer. No details. No admission of wrongdoing. Just a quiet exit that allowed them to pretend they'd handled the issue internally. But his personnel file told a different story. Kovac was terminated not just for arresting Judge Brennan, but for the pattern of behavior that arrest exposed. Internal Affairs had finally conducted the investigation they should have completed years earlier. They found everything Judge Brennan's lawyers had uncovered: discriminatory stops, ignored complaints, warning signs that had gone unaddressed. Kovac couldn't even contest the termination. His own body camera footage had destroyed any defense he might have attempted. His union representative reviewed the evidence and advised him to accept the firing and move on. There would be no arbitration, no appeal, no reinstatement. He was done in law enforcement. Some officers in the department were furious about the settlement. They saw it as the city sacrificing one of their own to appease activists. They complained the new policies would make it impossible to do their jobs, that they'd be second-guessed at every turn, that the oversight committee was nothing more than a witch hunt. But other officers, those who had been doing their jobs properly all along, welcomed the changes. They were tired of officers like Kovac tarnishing everyone's reputation. They were tired of inheriting community distrust created by a handful of bad actors who never faced consequences. They understood something fundamental. Accountability protects good officers by removing bad ones. Implementing the settlement terms took 18 months. The Oversight Committee proved to be the most contentious element. The department resisted nearly every aspect of its structure, attempting to limit its authority and access. Judge Brennan's legal team threatened to return to court multiple times before the committee finally launched with genuine power to investigate and issue binding recommendations. The committee's first major action sent shockwaves through the department. They reviewed 3 years of body camera footage and identified 12 officers with troubling patterns, not necessarily legal, but deeply problematic: disproportionate stops of minorities, aggressive language, unnecessary escalation. These officers were flagged for additional training and closer supervision. 2 were ultimately terminated after investigations revealed policy violations. The message was unmistakable. The old way of operating was over. But the real test came when the committee investigated a use of force incident the department had already cleared as justified. An officer had tossed a teenager during a traffic stop. The internal review found no policy violations. The committee disagreed. They examined the full context, the officer's history, the absence of de-escalation attempts, and concluded the force was unnecessary. They recommended discipline. The police union erupted. This was exactly what they feared: civilians overriding trained officers and tactical decisions. They threatened legal action, slowdowns, every pressure tactic available. The committee stood firm and released its full report publicly. The community read it. They saw detailed analysis explaining precisely why the force was unjustified. They saw an oversight system that actually worked. Pressure on the department intensified. Eventually, the chief implemented the committee's recommendations. The officer received a suspension and mandatory retraining. More importantly, the incident triggered policy reforms clarifying when tasers were appropriate. The teenager's family, who had been considering a lawsuit, accepted an apology and settlement after witnessing a process that took their concerns seriously. Judge Brennan observed all of this from her chambers. She had returned to the bench 6 months after the settlement, reassigned to a different jurisdiction to avoid any appearance of bias in cases involving the department. Her colleagues treated her with a mixture of respect and discomfort. Some admired her resolve. Others believed she had complicated their roles by stepping into the spotlight rather than remaining above it. She didn't care. She had done what needed to be done. 2 years after her arrest, Judge Brennan was invited to speak at a National Criminal Justice Reform Conference. She accepted. Her speech focused on an uncomfortable truth. The system wasn't broken. It was functioning exactly as designed. It was designed to grant enormous discretion to officers with minimal accountability. Designed to shield law enforcement from consequences. Designed to make it extraordinarily difficult for victims to prove misconduct. Her arrest was an anomaly. It was a system operating normally. The only unusual element was that she had the knowledge and resources to fight back. She spoke about the dozens of people she had sentenced for resisting arrest or obstruction, now wondering how many of those encounters began exactly like hers. She reflected on defendants who insisted they had done nothing wrong, that the officer had no legitimate reason to stop them, like most judges. She had assumed officers must have had justification that simply wasn't articulated clearly in reports. Now she understood. Those defendants might have been telling the truth. They might have been arrested for the same reason she was, for existing while black in a space where someone with a badge decided they didn't belong. The speech went viral. Conservative commentators accused her of being anti-police. Progressive voices praised her for speaking truth to power. She ignored both. She wasn't interested in symbolism. She was interested in results, in ensuring the settlement reforms were actually implemented rather than performed for optics. 3 years after her arrest, the data began to tell a story. Stop patterns had shifted measurably. Officers were stopping fewer people overall, but those stops were more likely to result in legitimate enforcement actions, suggesting improved targeting. Complaints about discriminatory stops dropped by 40%. Use of force incidents declined. The Oversight Committee had investigated 32 cases and found misconduct in 11. Every finding resulted in discipline that held. The reforms were working, but they were fragile. A new mayor could defund the committee. A new chief could stop enforcing policies. The union could negotiate reforms away in the next contract cycle. Judge Brennan understood this wasn't permanent victory. It was a temporary shift requiring constant vigilance. Community groups formed during the controversy remained active, monitoring police activity and documenting patterns. Law students volunteered to assist residents in filing complaints. Local journalists continued investigating, asking questions, refusing to let officials quietly revert to old habits. The financial cost of that arrest continued to climb. The settlement was only the beginning. Insurance premiums for the department increased dramatically. The city hired additional staff to support oversight. Training expenses multiplied. Legal fees mounted as more citizens came forward emboldened by Brennan's success. During a budget hearing, one city council member attempted to calculate the total cost. Between the settlement legal expenses, increased insurance premiums, new positions, training programs, and lost productivity, the arrest had cost taxpayers between $3 and $4 million. $4 million because one officer couldn't tolerate being questioned by a black woman. But the human cost was harder to measure. Judge Brennan experienced lingering symptoms long after physical injuries healed. A police cruiser behind her in traffic would send her heart racing. An officer approaching too quickly in court would cause her body to tense. She began therapy 6 months after the arrest, something she initially resisted, believing she could manage alone. Her therapist explained that trauma doesn't respond to logic. Her brain had learned that police officers equaled danger. Reprogramming that response required time, practice, patience. Her family struggled too. Her sister became hypervigilant, recording police interactions whenever possible. Her teenage nephew developed anxiety about driving after seeing the arrest footage. Her 73-year-old mother stopped watching the news entirely, unable to separate each new incident from what nearly happened to her daughter. Trust within the broader community deteriorated further. Residents hesitated to call police for minor issues, fearing escalation. Neighborhood watch programs dissolved. Officers blamed activists and media coverage for eroding relationships, rarely acknowledging their own conduct as the root cause. Years later, Judge Brennan presided over a case that brought everything full circle. A 26-year-old man faced charges of resisting arrest and assaulting an officer. The police report claimed he attacked during a routine stop. Body camera footage showed something else entirely. He had asked why he was being stopped, and officers escalated immediately when he failed to comply, quickly with contradictory commands. Judge Brennan watched the footage 3 times. She recognized the confusion, the fear, the spiral. The prosecutor argued reasonable suspicion based on a description. Black male, 20s to 30s, medium build, dark clothing. What description? She asked. She suppressed the evidence obtained after the unlawful stop, effectively dismantling the case. She dismissed the charges. The young man cried. Legal analysts debated whether her personal experience created bias. Ethics complaints were filed. None succeeded. Nobody questioned whether former prosecutors sitting as judges were biased in favor of police. But a judge unlawfully arrested? Suddenly objectivity became controversial. 5 years after the parking lot encounter, she received a handwritten letter from prison. It was from the officer. He wasn't apologizing. He was explaining, blaming stress, danger, split-second decisions. She searched for remorse. She found none. She burned the letter. The Oversight Committee's 5-year report later documented measurable improvements across nearly every category. Stops were fewer and more justified. Complaints declined. Use of force decreased. Discipline occurred when misconduct was proven. The report emphasized fragility. Reform required maintenance, political will, public attention. The work was never finished. People sometimes asked Judge Brennan whether it was worth it, whether the trauma was justified by the reforms achieved. The question disturbed her. It implied her suffering was a necessary sacrifice for progress. Her arrest should never have been required. The fact that it took a federal judge being handcuffed on camera before the system responded proved how deeply flawed it was. Ordinary people had been saying the same things for decades. They just didn't have her platform. 6 years later, she returned to that gas station parking lot. The pavement had been repaved. No physical trace remained. But she remembered everything. The shock, the fear, the realization that her life could have ended there, and no one would have been held accountable. She drove away knowing one thing. The past couldn't be changed, but the future could be shaped. 31 minutes in handcuffs cost millions of dollars and transformed an entire department's policies. That's the price of assumptions. That's the cost of unchecked authority. Officer Kovac never worked in law enforcement again. Judge Brennan still serves on the federal bench. That alone isn't justice. Justice would mean federal judges and ordinary citizens receive equal protection from unlawful arrests. Justice would mean officers face consequences before someone powerful forces accountability. The gas station still operates on that corner. People pump gas every day, unaware they're standing where a federal judge was handcuffed for asking questions. The cameras still record. And somewhere, someone is still being stopped for matching a description that is little more than code for their skin color. The body camera footage from that night remains sealed under the settlement agreement, but everyone involved knows what it shows. An officer seeing what he expected to see instead of what was actually there. A judge maintaining composure while her rights were violated. 31 minutes. That's what it took to expose a system. And that's how long it can take to change one.